implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development have been designed to provide a voluntary, participatory and transparent follow-up and review framework. So when I said enforce in my earlier statement, I probably overspoke or misspoke. Let me say that generally, for these mechanisms to work, there are some principles, and you may disagree with me in subsequent presentations, but what is needed for the mechanism, the institutional mechanisms put in place at whatever level, are clear objectives. As you know, the 17 United Nations SDGs have about 165, I forget the exact number, 165 sub-goals. So clear objectives to specify what is hoped to achieve, certainly by 2030, which probably is tomorrow in the long thrust of history. The second is to embed in these mechanisms some incentives, robust enough to encourage implementation and not to create too much of a burden. Clearly, implementation of the UN SDGs is an expensive process, and the estimations by PwC have been in the range of several trillion with a T, several trillion US dollars. And finally, the use of champions in creating mechanisms, institutional mechanism, is not a bad idea at all to drive learning, to drive the learning curve as you implement these goals. So the first classification of institutional mechanisms I wish to note would be at the state level, and they include, and this is the well-known ministerial annual review put in place by the UN SDG. So there is a high-level governmental, national, well, I should say international meeting at the ministerial level that reviews the progress that is made. The second one are the development cooperation forums, and I think some of you here present in the audience may have participated.
Be handed over to the panelists. We can have discussion right now. We can go to the next one also. I would request Professor Tele first. Okay, Rajiv. Okay, Mr. Rajiv, if you can start with your deliberation, and then later on we can have discussion also. But first, let's listen to this. What are her views about this institutional mechanism on sustainable development? Sorry.
Thank you. I already agree with the American professor on what he said about the importance of incentives and incentive systems for encouraging implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And previously, at the previous session, we discussed emission trade, which is carbon emission trade, which is one of such incentive mechanisms, a market-based mechanism for solving the climate targets. That's one good example. If that works at a global level, then we have agreed on the global goals. We can create an efficient and fair system, even though the emission trade does have its flaws, and the price may be too low for companies to do as much as they could, price of the emission, and fairness of the separate systems, of European Chinese system separately, and all these issues, but still a good effort towards such an institutional mechanism American professor mentioned. And learning curves and cooperation forums really important. I'd like to give the mic to Pelle.
So may I start something? Till then your slides are being put into the place.
But they are there, but because of
okay.
I think that we are meeting.
Okay, slides are there?
Yeah.
Okay. Then this institutional mechanism, actually we are doing a paper on this. I have one paper which is already published and another one we are developing. This, when you talk about this institutional mechanism, it looks from the outside it is very, very simple. But very less research has been done on this. Very, very less research has been done on this. Only people started doing or thinking or doing some paper on this, that in the post-90s. And if you take from Scott's words, then it is categorized into three parts. One part is your regulatory environment, the second part is your normative environment, and the third is your cognitive. Even while simplifying this, you can put this cognitive and this normative aspects, because both of are related to your tradition, culture, and your behavior. You can club it together. So practically you have two aspects of it. One is your regulatory mechanism and other is your cultural or behavioral factor. But at the same time, sustainable development can only be developed or integrated in the system till we have a sustained mechanism of this regulatory environment and the behavioral or cultural environment. Welcome. John, are you back? Can you hear me?
Back. There is some delay in the feedback from the image. I don't know if it's
No, no,
the
that's
sound as well.
no,
That's
that's
better. That's better.
yeah,
That's
connection. That's a disconnection
So,
actually.
I don't know how much time I have, so let me quickly move through this. I said there were.
Yeah.
I would like to illustrate 5 kinds of institutional mechanisms. The first
Okay.
one is at the national level, at the international level, and some examples of that, to recap what I said, is the annual ministerial review of the UN SDGs, of the United Nations. Another one is the International Monetary Fund, Article 4. Also, I would include the OECD, Organizations for Economic Cooperation and Development, peer reviews, which is increasingly building mechanisms of review for sustainability. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, John.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And there are a number of efforts at the regional level. One that comes to mind is the African Review Mechanism. So that's one kind of mechanism at the state level, largely directed at UN member states. Another one which deserves particular attention and on which I really can't say that I know much is the mechanism set in place during the Paris Agreement in December of 2015 in its Article 6, Paragraph 4, which creates a sustainable development mechanism, an SDM, which builds on some of the prior Kyoto flexible mechanism for clean development. This is a new mechanism which set goals in motion, largely towards reducing global warming temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius, as you know, and some degree of decarbonization with a long-term perspective. That is an interesting mechanism because it sets in motion some offsetting on the part of the member states. Clearly, the United States is not a party to that anymore, since President Donald Trump has more or less pulled the United States out of the Paris Accords. So that's the second class of mechanism. A third class of mechanism that I chose to focus on a little bit comes out of the tradition of UNIDO, and I think many of you know a good bit about the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And UNIDO has created a number of technology centers and networks to promote cooperation in disseminating, in diffusing clean and sound technologies for the environment. There are a number of those examples, and I think several of them are in India. UNIDO has created NCPC, so that's United Nations acronyms, National Cleaner Production Centers, which focus on dealing with small, medium-sized enterprises to encourage them to adopt sustainable production techniques. Another example of a UNIDO center are the climate technology centers. I don't think very many of them have been created, and it could be that our colleagues from Finland are aware of that, whether it's the case or not. Another example of a UNIDO implementation center, which I consider a mechanism, are international technology centers located in various countries, particularly emerging countries, to develop specific technologies, especially in the field of renewable energy. And here I think we have a lot to learn from India because of frugal innovation in India, because of the, correct me Rabi, the Jugaad system?
Yeah, Jugaad.
Am I saying that correctly?
Jugaad, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And then there are a number of other UNIDO centers. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list. Moving on, a fourth category of institutional mechanism I want to point out is a US one. It's an attempt by the accounting profession in the United States to build in some metrics and accounting standards that would reflect the work at the corporate level of public firms. By public firms, I mean firms that are traded on the stock market. And this was established in 2011. It's a weak attempt, but it is one nonetheless. It's called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, and it is an independent private sector standard setting organization. And it seeks to encourage the professions in accounting in the United States to give more attention to accounting standards for 79 industries in 11 sectors. It's moving slowly, incrementally. There's a lot of training, a lot of debate, and often not much agreement given the nature of the very decentralized system here. And finally, number 5, getting to the end of my brief presentation, is an initiative that I rather like. It's the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. And again, it's a set of international independent standards. It's a mechanism that has put in place a number of international independent standards, and that helps business and governments and other organizations, therefore NGOs, to understand and communicate their impact on issues contained in the UN SDGs. Of course, climate change, but also human rights, also corruptions, also gender equality, and the like. I was privileged last Friday in Atlanta, Georgia, to take part in a workshop to teach more about India to about 50 professors in the southeastern region of the United States. Our Consul General of India was there, and we had a whole day devoted to conveying to our audience made up of professors in business, in economics, in international studies, the impact of India and my focus was, of course, looking at the contribution of India in sustainability, which is significant given the role of the National Transformation Institution in India. I will stop here, and I will be glad to let the chair guide us into the next phase of the proceedings. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Professor John, for a very enlightening words also. And the way you specified the 5 objectives in a very short speech, that is really very enlightening for us and really very informative also for us. And when you talked about all the global initiatives, that is really good. And really when you talked about the Indian initiatives and the role of India in sustainable development, that is also very encouraging for us. In fact, when I was coming in the morning, I was thinking that I may not be very suitable as a chair for this session, as my subject, my academic subject is different from this. I am a plant scientist, but in the while coming over on way, I was thinking that is it really so that sustainable development and the role of higher institution in developing the mechanisms for sustainable development, is it really so that anyone from any subject can be far from it? Yes, I think it's never. And being a plant scientist, being a microbiologist, and being a leader in the higher education institute, I think that's every one of you are associated with the sustainable development, and your words about this India and the role in the sustainable development, I would like to share at the end my views about it also. But before that, I would like to listen to, and all of us would like to listen to other panelists also. Now, I request Shri Rajiv Saxena. Yeah, I think your this thing is ready. Your PPT is ready.
PPT is already there.
Till that time, we can take some questions. Anybody?
What is, John, may I thank you for enlightening, especially me, who am not maybe expert in this institutional mechanism, but what is your, or how have you become involved in trying to understand Indian policies and doings in sustainability?
Well,
That I know much better. Okay, please.
okay. Am I projecting material on the board or not? Are you just seeing me, or are you seeing a presentation that I want to bring up?
No, we are just seeing you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and that's a complicated question. My perspective is really in the about 13 years ago. I became concerned that we were not understanding appropriately the role played by the private sector
Won't disturb me.
in demonstrating through pilot projects, sometimes through rhetoric rather than real action, but nonetheless, the increasing importance of the private sector in implementing sustainable practice, life cycle approaches to the use of raw material and resources. And so in 2006, at Georgia Tech, in alliance with a French university, the University of Nancy in Lorraine, France, on the Franco-German border, we created a mechanism called, a very limited, modest mechanism called Multinational Enterprise and Sustainable Development. And we have over the years, in a very incremental, slow-moving way, tried to understand the part that largely multinational enterprises, but also medium-sized enterprises play in showing different means and mechanisms to reduce wasteful energy consumption, to set in place a set of corporate accounting and corporate practices standards to guide the firm in gradually growing a different philosophy, one leading to a more acute sense of corporate social responsibility, but at the same time balancing the issues between corporate social responsibility and profit making. In the case of the United States, the process is very difficult because the prevailing view historically, at least in the 20th century, has been the Milton Friedman approach. You remember Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winner, monetary economist, who said in essence, the business of business is business, which sort of summarizes a whole philosophy that really business corporations should not play the part, should not really do government's bidding. Now that has changed a lot. We have developed in the United States a whole range of tools, a very detailed literature on corporate social responsibility, which has gradually moved in the direction of sustainability, business sustainability in the broad sense. For example, in my own university, we have a sister center in the business school, which is a business sustainability center. And we're looking at the best practices through alliances with corporations and academic studies. So in the case of my interest in India, well, I mean, I don't want to be overlong here. My interest in India really goes back to my undergraduate years in Florida. I had a mentor at the time, now deceased, Pandarinath Prabhu, who was an Indian social psychologist, who was a distinguished professor. And I was an undergraduate student, quite young, and he said, I'm writing a book on Hindu social organization. You're going to be my gopher, my research assistant. I said, I know nothing about India. I know nothing about Hindu social organization. He said, don't worry, you're going to learn. And that was about 30, 40, more than that, 40 years ago. And ever since my undergraduate years, I've always been keenly interested in India. It is the most complex country in the world, without doubt. And the 29 states of India each have their own way of implementing sustainable measures. It's fascinating to see how India proceeds. The subject of my conversation last Friday, and I will stop here, was evaluating India's effort in sustainable development goals. And here you can conclude two ways. You can say it's absolutely a stellar achievement in terms of the philosophy, in terms of decentralizing the efforts, or you can say there's a long, long way to go. Whether you're looking at gender equality, rural housing, sanitation, you know, the usual metrics that we look at. I made the case that India was really showing the way for many countries, and the Indian model was one that we should be a model that we should really look at very closely and derive lessons from, and transfer some of the ideas and principles back to other parts of the world.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Can I ask him a question?
Yeah.
Question to you. I am Jagannathan here.
Yes, sir.
When you talk about
Yes, sir.
institutional mechanism, do you bring in political factors in coming to a solution through institutional mechanism? I am referring specifically to the carbon credit system that prevails as a trading item among the countries. Thank you.
Complex question. Well, there is a market, pseudo-market that is arising. I confess to say I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to misstate the question here. Could you rephrase it, because I'm not sure. There are two questions there. If I seem to.
I'll try to deconstruct my question with detail. When you talk about institutional mechanism, you referred about issues like gender equalities and all those human rights and all.
Yes.
Now, is it possible to address these issues unless one deconstruct the political control which has brought about these types of differences? And is it possible for us to move forward in sustainable development unless we resolve these political issues? I am talking with specific reference to countries like India and other South Asian countries.
Obviously, the body politic drives the debate. In the case of India, I believe you have created, forgive me if I forget the name, a national institution for the transformation of India. Correct? What is it called? Nitan Hayog? Help me out. It's a unique mechanism in which. What is the name again, please? Exactly, yes. National Institution for the Transformation of India. Obviously, it has created its own set of goals, 5-year, 10-year goals in a planning sort of fashion. It clearly is a body that reflects the priorities of the Narendra Modi government. It is chaired, I believe, by the Prime Minister. There is a chair, of course.
Yeah.
We had the vice chair in Atlanta, Georgia, 2 years ago, talk to us. So in terms of trying to sort of reflect the political priorities of the different key actors in any given society, pressure groups, political parties, ruling parties, and the like, clearly that is the filtering mechanism through which the UN SDGs must be translated in the local context, in the regional context, in the national context. So India has had its own unique ways of understanding the UN SDGs. The point I'm trying to make is that given the size of India, the complexity of India, and the challenges of India, that what the approach taken by India is one from which we can learn. Now, clearly, if you take the Indian approach to issues of water, we have issues of water in the southeastern United States, but they're of a different nature. The lessons to be learned from India applies to some degree, but the political process is an essential component of it. If you take the case of the United States, clearly the executive branch of government does not consider that it should give up any of its sovereignty to a United Nations body in the implementation of very ambitious goals that require a significant contribution from the United States budget in the range of 20-25% of the estimated cost to achieve the 16 UN SDGs by 2030, which is estimated at I'm not sure actually, I think it's estimated at more than that, $2 trillion US. So clearly the United States would be expected to make a significant contribution. And that was the argument made by the Trump administration when they pulled out of the Paris Accords. Now clearly there is a hope that President Trump can be brought back in the Paris Accord. But the political drift in the United States is not amenable to that. I believe in India you have elections coming up in spring of 2019.
Yeah.
I am not sure that sustainability will be a major goal. Perhaps you can enlighten me on that. But to make a long story short, the issue is highly political. As you break it down, there are 17 goals. They cover the waterfront, as we say. Different countries have chosen different goals to focus on, which are more reflective of their priorities, their economic level of development. I would say India faces the challenge of being active on all 17 UN SDGs.
Yeah.
And that's a huge challenge. What I am most impressed by is that each of the member states of the all-union government has taken different approaches. For example, the state of Karnataka, I think, has focused on 12 technologies, if I recall. I don't know the level of progress. Of course, I have no way of knowing. I don't have that detailed level of knowledge. But different states in India are focusing in their own particular way in making a contribution. So there is some degree of decentralization. I think that's remarkable. Similarly, in the United States, we have seen that cities and states, American states, are trying to pick up the slack where the federal government has let go in the Paris Accord. What you have are various coalitions of academic entities, state governments, local governments, that have said, we are going to implement the SDGs at the local level. And obviously that's eminently political at the local, regional level. I'm not sure I've answered your question because I sense a deeply philosophical issue, one of how you think through the UN SDGs and how you reduce them into a political program that makes sense in terms of the national political environment. Clearly, you have some panelists from Finland. It would be interesting to hear what they have to say about the implementation of UN SDGs in the case of Finland. And these are very different national environments, clearly. I mean,
and for enlightening us on various topics. And really, I am really impressed by your knowledge on India. And I would like to add one more thing, that sustainable
Way
development.
to go. I'm afraid my knowledge of India is very minimal.
Sustainable development, I would like to add only one thing, that sustainable development is one thing where the government is taking initiatives, other states are also taking initiatives along with NGOs and other academic bodies also, but conservation is in our blood. So if the conservation is in our blood, in our genetic makeup, so I think we can lead the world with sustainable development issues. So I am relating it to somehow the conservation that is there with every family in India, every, say, philosophically and otherwise also. That's the way of life we lead with all sorts of conservations. And I would like to give some examples at the end only. But I am really thankful and really enlightened that you have so much of study on India and would like to take this forward. Thank you very much. And I would like to request now Mr.
I think I will not wait for the session anymore, because I think when he says that 2019 we have election, it's a little political comment, but I think that is driven to sustain the present government actually. So it is about sustainability of the present government.
This person the mic so that he can also clearly audio. It is.
Hello. Yeah. Very quickly on briefly about Mazars. Mazars is a global organization, and I'm glad to share some of these statistics because we talked about gender diversity and discrimination and things like that. So Mazars strictly is a global organization based out of Paris. We are 20,000 people globally, and 50% of them are women. And that number is even not kind of disappointing when we go to the top level, because this is an audit and advisory organization globally. We are 970 partners, and 28% of the partners are women actually. So when you go to the top also, that ratio is quite encouraging actually. So we have maintained that gender diversity, and we know that